Good morning, everybody, here in presence and also online on the screens of our second day of this symposium in honor to Erich Mendelsohn and to find a way for an application to put his work into international heritage. We just toured this building, which is a masterpiece of Erich Mendelsohn's work from 1928 to 1930. Thank you to Regina Stephan, who wonderfully explained, for instance, the sketches which are exposed downstairs in the hall. It's great to have you all on board for the second day. And today, this session is called The International Influence on and Through Erich Mendelsohn's Work. It will be the fourth session lasting from 10 to 12 o'clock, and then it will be followed by a lunch break from 12 to 1 o'clock. In the afternoon, on the fifth session from 1 to 3 o'clock, we will have contributions that focus on the history. And at the end of the day, there will be a sixth session with a closing panel discussion, which might be most important and most interesting, assumingly to resume everything which was discussed yesterday and will be discussed today. My name is Andrea Jütten. I'm an active DOCOMOMO Germany and international member and also an architect. And briefly, as you know from yesterday, the key of our exploring here is to filter out a suitable and provable structure or a first concept of a tentative submission on 3 pages, according to the hint of Brigitta Ringbeck yesterday. So it should be short and convincing, as she put it. I think the 3-paper concept then, correct me if I'm wrong, Jörg Haspel, but I think this should be transferred into the official nomination to fill the Erich Mendelsohn gap of the UNESCO World Heritage List by now. Here now, I will be guiding you through our first 3 new coming contributions this morning. I'm curious to see which buildings of Erich Mendelsohn might make it, and at the end of our symposium, and most of all, which special, outstanding, universal values shall give proof for them in case of serial nomination. Will it be authenticity and integrity, or maybe his innovation of construction, or his cosmopolitism, or his answer on the genius loci, or maybe his unique but not consistent alternative modernist language of forms, which is closer to Frank Lloyd Wright and Oscar Niemeyer than to Gropius, or his visionary sketching by hand he started his projects with, or maybe his innovative concept of synagogues, which we learned yesterday with his special spiritual background of Zionism. We will see. Today, our first contribution carries the title Erich Mendelsohn and the Reception of Modernism in England from 1920 to 1933, held by Alan Powers. Even though Alan Powers is very well known by many publications, I feel honored now to introduce him with a short overview over his writer. Dr. Alan Powers. He is a senior lecturer at the London School of Architecture and at the School of Architecture and Planning of the University of Kent. Powers is a specialist in 1930s modernism in Britain as conservationist, teacher, and historian. He has published a major monograph on Sergei Chermayev in 2001 and visited the Mendelsohn and Chermayev buildings on several occasions. Researches in his book Bauhaus Goes West from 2019. He is an active member of DOCOMOMO International and DOCOMOMO UK and has been part of the English Heritage Post-War Listing Advisory Committee from 1992 to 2002. Further memberships in different functions include the Society of Antiquaries, 20th Century Society, Society of Architectural Historians of Great Britain, and he is an honorary fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects. Welcome, Alan Powers.
This is a short paper, so I'm limiting what I'm covering to the period before Mendelsohn actually settles in England in 1933. And what I'm looking at is not any influence he might have had on British architecture during that time, although I think there was some, but simply how his work and his presence were reported mainly in publications. And you can see here the photograph of him on his first visit in May 1930, which will come later. One dominant theme in the study of British architecture between 1918 and 1939 is the development of the modern movement in a country seen as indifferent or hostile to it. Another theme is related and is on the role of émigré architects and writers in aiding this assimilation of modern architecture. Many of the émigrés were from Germany, among whom Walter Gropius is the best known, but I want to put forward the evidence that Erich Mendelsohn had a special place as the first whose name became well known in England, marking a distinctive early phase in the process. Before 1914, architects in Britain were very ignorant of German architecture and art, despite the efforts of a small number of writers and collectors who tried to mediate between the two countries. After 1918, the shadow of war inevitably influenced how Germany was seen, although it began to gain glamour in various respects and became a popular holiday destination, especially for young intellectuals. An architect and writer, Gordon Holt, published a travelogue of a visit to Germany in 1923 in the Architect's Journal, which opened saying, "For reasons not altogether unjustified, it has been the fashion in certain quarters to asperse Teutonic culture." He goes on to describe how theories of racial character were prominent, and he seems to be following those, contrasting northern qualities with supposed Latin qualities. The northern qualities he saw, however, as a valuable counterpart to the Latin, which he was assuming to be dominant, saying that they were both daring and unsophisticated. And this, I think, is quite an important popular view about what German architecture was meant to be. In modern German architecture in 1923, Holt found, quote, ableness, fearlessness, and, let us say the word, downright beauty, which evidently he wasn't expecting to find. He picks out the word expressionist and admits that although he saw, quote, monstrosities so self-conscious and so precipitated, he admitted that they do here and there show very original and potent minds. So it's a love-hate relationship in this, I have to say, rather insignificant text, but it's perhaps indicative of a certain current of thought. But writing in August 1923, he would, not very long before, have seen the publication of Mendelsohn's work in the Architectural Review, actually in May 1923. This prestigious London magazine had only recently shown any interest in modern architecture in Germany, and this was owing, I think, entirely to this man, Hermann Georg Schäfer, who was born in San Francisco to German émigré parents. He aimed to become a writer, although he also studied art and architecture and had a job in an architectural office. There is a lengthy and informative Wikipedia entry on Schäfer, which recounts his time spent in London between 1905 and 1907, and again in 1911 to 15, after a return to America, working as a freelance writer and translator. He mixed with writers and thinkers, representatives of the avant-garde, as well as of conservative movements, and in 1912 married an English poet, Ethel Talbot. His play, The New Shylock, was performed in Danzig and in Manchester in 1913. I haven't been able to find a printed text. He was well placed, therefore, to act as a cultural conduit for architecture between Germany and the English-speaking world, particularly because in 1915, feeling pressured by his German name and a visit from a detective to his house in London, Schäffer and his wife travelled via Amsterdam to Berlin, where he remained for the rest of his life. Sad to say, he cut his throat in 1927 and died aged 51, owing to severe depression. Schäffer visited Mendelssohn's exhibition of 1919 in the Paul Cassira Gallery in Berlin and published an article on it in The Dial, the American Modernist Journal, in 1921. His name appears for the only time in Mendelssohn's correspondence with his wife in 1922 in connection with the English edition of Mendelssohn's Buildings and Sketches, which was published in London by Ernest Benn in Schäffer's translation in 1923. And there is also discussion of a possible visit for Mendelssohn to America. So Schäffer is acting almost like his manager, it seems, to promote him in English-speaking countries. Schäffer then published this article in the Architectural Review in May 1923, one of a series in which he also covered Bruno Taut, Walter Gropius, and Hans Pelzig. This was an exceptional series because neither before nor after was there anything similar in terms of a organized series of articles on modern German architecture, or indeed modern architecture of any kind. And it remains a bit mysterious how it came about. But through this, then these images, these very compelling images of Mendelssohn's work, would have been widely seen. Indeed, apart from Pelzig, all the architects he wrote about had relatively little built work to show. And in Mendelssohn's case, it's only the Einstein Tower. But it was presumably this article and the images with it that established Mendelssohn as a supposedly representative figure of German expressionism in the English mind. And this one building was taken to represent the whole movement, reinforced perhaps by Schäffer's book of 1924, from which this is an opening, The Vision of German Arts, which covered all the arts. This also, as well as the Buildings and Sketches, was published by Ernest Benn. And this is from the chapter Activistic Architecture, in which Mendelssohn is the only figure to be discussed at any length. And this reproduces the same drawings that were seen in the Architectural Review. And it does occur to me that one could explain this early rise to prominence of Mendelssohn by the fact that these images could be rendered easily for printing as black and white printing blocks and printed with text without the expense of a half-tone photographic plate, which at that date would have made a considerable difference. So if you want to show a German architect, Mendelssohn makes it easy for you through these drawings. Anyway, this degree of publishing activity, although still relatively small, was unique for a German architect of any kind in Britain at this time, although its impact is hard to judge. In 1924, the principal of the Architectural Association, Howard Morley Robertson, included two examples of Mendelssohn's work in his textbook, The Principles of Architectural Composition, which is, on the whole, very much a Beaux-Arts primer for students. The first, almost inevitably, is the Einstein Tower, which appears as a line-drawn illustration in the chapter on contrast in form and mass, sharing the page with a building by Piet Kramer. The text references the building, including, as you can see here, its effort to grapple with pure form and mold it into architectural shapes. He sort of picks up this language of dynamism, while warning also in relation to the tower that trying to turn hard and resistant materials into, quote, forms suitable to clay modeling can only be achieved, quote, at the cost of fantastic difficulty and expense. This I think, as a warning to students, don't try this. The Berliner Tageblatt building was also included, as you can see here, in another drawing. I assume these drawings are by Robertson, but it's not clear from the book. And here he writes that it is suffering from the overemphasis and coarseness of handling. Well, to quote Oscar Wilde, the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. And in this instance, Mendelsohn made more impact than the only two other famous modernists in the book, Wright and Corbusier, who were represented by uncharacteristically symmetrical plans. But Robertson remained interested in Mendelssohn, and one can see how his ideas begin to change as he recognizes that there is something here that engages him. He reviewed the Schäfer translation of Buildings and Sketches in the beginning of 1925, which was 2 years after the year of publication, in the Architectural Review, taking Mendelssohn as representative both of modernism and as a form of continuity from Gothic. And the quote I've picked out here shows, I think, Robertson's strange confusion about what it is he's trying to say about this, that it's both intellectual and it's spiritual in this view. And I think these are cliches circulating at the time about what modern architecture might be. So this is qualified praise, but I think it represents the way that Mendelssohn became a sort of stick to beat more conservative colleagues with. Robertson was a very middle-of-the-road figure, but he was not an outright conservative, as many other architecture school heads were at that time. So Mendelssohn becomes, you might say, a sort of Trojan horse for modernism as a whole. What he represented, though, was not necessarily received very gladly. I think because it very obviously represented through these drawings, particularly what many moderate progressive architectural thinkers, perhaps the successors of the arts and crafts movement, thought of as stunt architecture. So one of these, an Irish architect, Manning Robertson, no relation of Howard, in his book, The Layman and Modern Architecture in 1924, picked out the Einstein Tower as, quote, shouting its symbolical message with assertive incoherence and rising from its base, resembling a crazy concrete battleship. If Mendelssohn had not built the Einstein Tower, but the rest of his work were the same, I think perceptions of him would have been quite different. But as it was, this building was one that was always referenced. So in writing this review, Howard Robertson seems to be hedging his bets, which was something he often did. By 1929, however, Robertson's views had changed considerably. He'd become a prolific writer on European modern movements for British audiences in articles researched with his AA colleague, F.R. Yerbury, who took the photographs. Mendelssohn's work was picked up here in the Architect and Building News, where this series was mainly published, in 1929. And in contrast to the negative views of 5 years before, this piece, as you can see here, called Dynamics in German Street Architecture, opened with a photograph of, quote, the amazing corner of Erich Mendelsohn's Haus Mossa in Berlin. And he wrote, there is no country, Holland not excepted, where the modern architecture exhibits to the degree found in Germany that peculiar quality which, in the scale of human emotions, is labeled excitement. So Mendelssohn becomes the representative figure for the whole German movement here, with these particularly emotive adjectives attached. It has to be said that there's absolutely nothing in the architecture that Robertson and his partner John Murray Easton executed that comes anywhere near this. They were relatively modern among other architect colleagues at the time, but the words, as it were, go ahead of the deeds. Later in 1929, Robertson did another article about the Universum Cinema with almost mystical enthusiasm. So there is something by 1929 that architects in Britain are looking for, and Mendelsohn seems to provide it. I speculate it may have been on the visit to write the Universum article that Robertson could have met Mendelsohn, because for one way or another, he invited him to visit London in May 1930 for an exhibition of his work at the Architectural Association, where he was in charge, and where he also gave a lecture on the 19th of May. In fact, two lectures, one for the students and one for the members and the general public. And this is the occasion when, as far as I can tell, Mendelsohn was almost welcomed as a hero. And there was a lot of press coverage about his visit. The actual text, and this is a photocopy, I think probably kindly sent to me by Ita Heinze Greenberg many years ago, and indeed I'd forgotten I had it, but it's fascinating for many reasons, including that it says New York 1927, suggesting that he had already given this paper there, and then only mildly changed it for London 1930, as it says. And I guess this may be because it was in English already. He didn't have to write something else and have it translated again. And we can see how he has marked it up for reading it aloud, knowing where the emphasis and the pauses should come, because apparently at this date his English was not very good. So this was printed more or less verbatim.
Alan, may I remind you, you have another 5 minutes, please?
Thank you. And became widely publicized. One of the interesting comments comes here from Harold Nicholson, a member of Parliament, who met Mendelsohn at a dinner of the Architecture Club, which followed. And so here, in a popular column he wrote for the Listener magazine, he's discussing Mendelsohn in approving terms. A piece by Mendelsohn himself appeared in the same magazine the following year. But I think it's after 1930 that there's a kind of convergence, because the British architects are getting more open towards modernism, and Mendelsohn is moving more towards the kind of modernism that they found they could approve of. The more extreme expressionism has disappeared. So there is quite a lot of coverage of this very building, and also of the House am Ruppenhorn, which several architects, including Serge Chemaev, visited, and of the Schockenstore in Chemnitz. An article written by Josef Umlauf, and I would be interested to know anything more about who he was. And it's these stores that are reflected during the 1930s, particularly in this design, a very well-known piece, the Peter Jones store in Sloane Square in Chelsea, in which really the moving spirit was Charles Herbert Riley. This is pictured on his autobiography. He had retired from teaching at Liverpool University, but before then had invited Mendelsohn to come there and speak in 1933, which was also widely covered. And it was Riley, as he describes in this book, who helped to arrange for Mendelsohn's 5-year visa to stay and work in London. So there is I think, a sort of resolution at this point in 1933, at the end of the year, when Mendelsohn arrives in London. Incidentally, his work was illustrated here, not so much for aesthetics, but simply for the technical aspects of the steel frame, in an article trying to persuade the building authorities to allow a more progressive form of steel frame. He was drawn to London in 1932 and 33 through the project for the European Academy of the Mediterranean. So here we see him in a photograph in Chamaev's garden with his co-director, Aux Enfants. And I think this engagement with this institution, which had no particular London base, was probably kind of moved or relocated to London, partly, I think, because they thought they could raise money there, but also because there was a small group of welcoming and interested people, Chamaev among them, who became Mendelssohn's partner. So Mendelssohn arrived about a year later, Walter Gropius arrived, and one could conclude by saying that the historiography since then is some kind of contest between these two, in which Gropius emerges as the obvious winner in terms of reputation. Here, perhaps poignantly expressing this, are the two buildings they did side by side for two patrons who were cousins in Chelsea. So there I will stop.
Thank you, Alan Powers, for this very exciting contribution. It was really focused on his reception of modernism in England. I didn't know, and I noted that especially Howard Robertson started in warning the architectural students, and 2 years later he did write about his dynamic forces expressed in action and was confused, and then another 2 years later, he describes in Excitement works of temperament, dynamics in German street architecture. That gives an impression how Erich Mendelsohn's expressionist architecture was perceived. Is there any direct question from the audience? If so, please feel free. There's Ita Heinze Greenback. Somebody need to pass a microphone.
Hello, Ellen. Thank you very much for the illuminating paper you gave. Just a very, very short comment, because we talked a lot yesterday also about the role of Louise Mendelssohn, not to forget her impact in Mendelssohn's work. So English was her part. She knew English very well, and she did a lot of translation work for him, and she probably also helped in marking the stresses how to speak English. So just another perspective on Louise Mendelssohn's impact and role. It's, yeah.
Anybody else?
A remark about the drawing by Robertson in the first Robertson book about the rule of composition for his students. Those pictures are probably just redraw from the photos in building and structure by Mendelssohn. Because if you look in the book, you find that for both the Einstein Tower and the Mosse building, there are the photographs that were by Custer. There are this exactly point of view. So they were simply redrawn from the photos, maybe by Robertson or by someone for him. But there is the when they came.
Alan Parson, I would frankly spoken something about the 3 buildings in England, and but you concentrated on how the German work of Erich Mendelsohn was perceived in England. What would be your idea of making a contribution to our aim for today? I mean, what do you have an idea of how to put your lecture into a special, outstanding value?
That I think is harder to answer, and maybe I didn't follow the brief. However, I think to realize that Mendelssohn was not coming, as it were, from a cold start into England, that he had visited and there was a dialogue going on. He is, as it were, embedded in the culture of architecture when he arrives, and then immediately on arrival works with Chimaev on the competition for the De La Warr Pavilion, and they are announced as the winners early in 1934. So that is quite exceptional, really, to get a major building so quickly on coming into a country. And perhaps what I've described has some connection with that. I'm sure the assessor, Thomas Tate, who was quite good at borrowing motifs from Mendelssohn, was quite aware whose drawings he was looking at when he was judging the competition.
I mean, there will be 2 other possibilities of putting up questions. Thank you so much, and please stay online to take part in our further discussions. I would like to announce now the next contributions that concentrate also on the influence of Erich Mendelsohn's work on others, looking to Berlin, Madrid, and Bilbao. It's held by Patxi, Eguiluz, and Carlos Copertone. Welcome here on board from Spain. They are architectural critics, curators, and researchers. Patxi Eguiluz is an architect also and focused on construction and urbanism. He edits books on art and architecture at Caniche Editorial and has curated and developed several exhibitions and projects at various institutions across Spain and abroad. Carlos Copertone completed his PhD at the University of Extremadura, specializing in urbanism. He edits books on art, architecture at Caniche Editorial also, and has curated and developed several exhibitions, programs, and projects. I think together you do that. Copertone has lectured extensively both in Spain and internationally. Recent exhibitions, talks, and publications include Port Architecture, Sergio Prego and Miguel Fisac, which is that the artist Sergio Prego reacts on the architect and his work of Miguel Fisac, is that right? And for instance, the talk Contadas Obras at Villa Mendelsohn at the CA2M, Centro de Arte 2 de Mayo in Madrid from 2020, and the book upcoming in the Venice Biennale this year, Artist's Book with Ignaz Abali for the Spanish Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. I pass my word to you. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. No? Is it? Yeah. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, dear friends, for being here. And thank you to the organizer for this symposium, for their energy, their passion, We feel honored to be here. And we are starting with our paper that involves 2 voices and 3 places.
Long before he had his own corpus of built architecture, Erich Mendelsohn's drawings made a powerful impact that quickly spread beyond his native Germany. Called Sporcar si trova, in English, by messing about one discovers, noted Piranesi about drawing. And indeed, Mendelssohn's early sketches soon turned him into a proto-influencer. We shall now try to analyze briefly his influence in Spain. Though he had not yet constructed any building, Erich Mendelsohn began to make a name for himself as an architect following an exhibition of his drawings at the Paul Cassirer Gallery in Berlin in 1919. These early sketches, the depicted architecture is not based on any physical reality or a specific commission, but rather an abstraction of desire. However, the work's profound materiality takes them far beyond the straightforward two-dimensionality, and they are imbued with great freedom of form and a strong sense of movement. Decades later, the Iraqi-British architect Zaha Hadid would follow in Mendelssohn's footsteps when she became, in the 70s, the leading exponent of another kind of new architecture, this time the constructivism. As with Mendelssohn, her initial renown was largely due to her early architectural drawings, as the impact they made despite the fact that she would not actually build until many years afterwards. To be exact, her first building was the fire station at Weil am Rhein in 1990. The influence of Mendelssohn's sketches soon hit Spain too. In 1924, the first journal of Spanish architectura, as you can see in the image, published an article about Mendelssohn, but not about his built work. It was focused on his sketches, the ones that hinted at a new way of doing things. Even though they were utopian projects, Spanish critics saw his work as architecture of the future. Alongside 2 of his drawings, the text claimed, with regards to Mendelssohn's work, if future critics overlook the tentative, rougher ideas common to all processes of innovation, they will be thus left with the pleasant task of analyzing the rare personality revealed in the designs. The drawings all share an apparent yearning for space that must take precedence, according to him, in all architectural creation over the relationship between limit and infinity, logic and feeling. By that time, he had already designed and built some of his most important works, such as the renovation of Rudolf Mosse printing press and newspaper offices in Berlin. For this project, Mendelssohn left the structure intact apart from the damaged corner entrance that he replaced with a surprisingly modern body, which then extended around the old structure. He greatly accentuated the corner by adding bold horizontal elements mirrored by further horizontal elements wrapped around the upper floors of the building. The use long strips and the sculpture features along the windows gave it a futuristic look, particularly when compared to the more classical Newberry buildings. It was perhaps the first example of rationalist building with expressionistic forms. In 1929, Mendelssohn's presence and reputation in Spain was further enhanced when he gave 2 lectures one in Madrid and one in Bilbao. Also, more pieces were published about him, showcasing his work to the country. Another edition of Arquitectura, this one, featured his Universum cinema in Berlin, as well as describing the huge impression that the building had made. These lectures in Bilbao and Madrid in November 29 were about, firstly, the experiences recounted by Mendelsohn in Ruslan, Europa, America, published that same year. Secondly, in the lectures, Mendelsohn went over his career up to that point. The press noted that it was interesting to see how his fantastical sketches gradually turned him into rational structure and a whole series of bodies, volumes, factories, housing, and urban estates of admirable cohesion. It was also claimed that Mendelsohn is celebrated due to his talent for handling space. His most impactful buildings stand out for the bold chiaroscuro that comes from the way he deals so skillfully with masses in space. At the end of this article, it is said, he was extremely applauded. The widespread impact of these articles, along with the two lectures, had a profound effect on Spain's subsequent urban architecture. In Madrid and Bilbao, numerous new buildings were clearly influenced by the emergency of this highly expressive architectural language. Without Mendelsohn, the so-called Spanish expressionist rationalism would never have come into being. Despite his reputation, he never built anything in our country. He had two commissions, a student residence and a house for the Dukes of Alba, but the death of the Duques and the civil war in Spain stopped them.
In Madrid, among the many buildings influenced by Mendelsohn, there are two standout examples of superb architecture that engage with their urban surrounding in an emphatic and iconic way, just as Mendelssohn's own building always responded so masterfully to the demands of the city, as well as the new ways of moving around it. This new flagship construction in Madrid can only really be understood by taking into account their specific urban setting. Unlike Le Corbusier-style rationalism, which imposed a new uniform model that sought to change the European city, such as Le Plan Voisin for Paris, Mendelssohn aimed to modify the city from within, being duly aware of his construction immediate context in order to improve the whole surrounding space. Thus, in 1931, Luis Martínez Feducci and Vicente Ezez write on Madrid's famous Gran Via, use a rounded edge with horizontal bars to resolve a corner space, thus creating one of the standout buildings of this new architecture in Spain, namely the Edificio Carrión. It was clearly influenced by the Mose building's aerodynamics and the way it dealt with the corner, though this building also had another very Mendelssohnian aspect. It was to be an advertising hoard, as with the Schocken department store or the Galeries Lafayette in Berlin. It was in a car-heavy location, so it needed a striking visual to grab the attention. The building became popular in Spain thanks to its huge neon logo, that of a drinks company. At this point, it is important to mention, as you can imagine, Robert Venturi and Dennis Scott Brown, who decades later in their book, Learning from Las Vegas, stated that the graphic sign in a space has become the architecture of this landscape. Not far from there, and in that same year, Gutiérrez Soto built the Cine Barceló, another corner building which is notable for its mix of naval imagery and a facade structure made up of horizontal strips and gaps. There are also countless examples of residential architecture like this in Madrid, built around the same time, such as residential building on Fernández de los Ríos, residential building on Vallehermoso, residential building on Benito Gutiérrez, or residential building on Pintor Rosales. A great many buildings went up in Madrid during this period. However, the start of the Spanish Civil War brought an abrupt end to the influence of this new kind of architecture that had never been used in the construction, that had even been used in the construction of cheap housing, term used to describe the smaller houses permitted following a change in the law. The style was used for one of Spain's most significant rationalist urban estates, namely El Viso, by Rafael Bergamín and Luis Blanco Soler. For many years, it was known in Madrid as the architect's estate, since various professionals lived there, as well as many other intellectuals who loved this new way of interacting with the world. Over the years, more and more Spanish publications noted Mendelsohn's new project. The magazine AC, Documentos de Actividad Contemporánea, described in an article their visit to the Columbus House in Berlin during its construction. It included an artist's impression of the final building, the floor plans, as well as images of the work in progress and construction detail. A later article showed a construction in Barcelona from that same year with a 1.2 meter thick load-bearing wall, contrasting it with the 0.25 meter thickness at the Columbus House. The writer highlighted the loss of ground space in the Barcelona building due to the walls taking up far more of the available terrain, lamenting the fact that this is being repeated in other new buildings. Mendelsohn and his architecture were seen as an example of new approach to architecture, one that should be implemented for various reasons. In this particular case, the building offered as much usable floor space as possible in line with the new structural solutions.
You can see those 2,621 pesetas was the cost of the floor that was lost with the heavy solutions of the Barcelona building instead of the solution of the new architecture of here in Berlin. In Bilbao, which was growing exponentially at that time, there were countless examples of these new forms springing up in the emerging peripheral states. The influence of Mendelssohn's 1929 lecture at the Hotel Carton in Bilbao, the leading city hotel at the area, was soon noticeable. There in Bilbao, several of the city's iconic buildings were constructed soon thereafter on significant corners of the city blocks. On such example is La Equitativa by Galíndez Zavala, completed in 1934. This building hosts the mixed program of offices and living spaces, and each of these uses has a distinct volumetric solution, but together they still make sense as a whole. The offices in the mezzanine space have their own body, which is set slightly forward from the rest of the structure, and they have a continuous wraparound window, which is clearly indebted to Mendelssohn's designs for the offices at the Universum complex. This new style was particularly prevalent in Bilbao's peripheral residential projects. It can be seen in Tomás Bilbao housing buildings in Ripa 6 and Alameda Urquijo, and in Rafael Fontan housing buildings on Ercilla. They are all of a somewhat restrained composition based on horizontal lines contrasting with curved elements, and they are undeniably Mendelssohnian in their makeup. Unlike what happened in Madrid, this new way of understanding architecture did not come to a complete halt in Bilbao following the outbreak of the Civil War. Another iconic building in Bilbao, the Garaje San Mamés, was designed in 1941 and completed in 1945 at the height of the post-war period in Spain, which elsewhere in the country brought about a return to a more classical style of architecture. Perhaps because its main use was linked to vehicles, the building combined a car park and housing. The architect José María Sainz Aguirre emphasizes the corner with a very Mendelssohn-esque aerodynamic curve, deftly merging the two streets. The transition is further asserted by a turret with decorative details that also recall the Germans' work. The first two floors, with a complete glazed horizontal base, as well as the use of typography to define the building's function within the city setting, are also proof of the ongoing influence in this city and in the whole of Spain of an architect who years earlier has been forced to abandon his own country and continent. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for this very deep insight of Mendelssohn as an influence on other architects. Are there any questions related, Jörg? Maybe somebody can pass the microphone.
I would like to thank you very much for the presentation, and not only for comparing similarities or parallels, but also for that they are related to articles, to lectures, to the reception, which can be already proved. And my question is, yesterday we saw the film of Yuki Draw, and we called Tel Aviv a Bauhaus city and a Mendelssohn city, and we discussed it. Is it something similar, you think, here? What does it mean, the influence of Erich Mendelsohn in other, in new buildings? How is this influence? How can it be proven to be made fruitful for a World Heritage nomination? That is my question.
So when you read about these buildings in articles and such in Spain, you everywhere is said that there is that is noted that there is a clear influence by Mendelssohnian and the Expressionist architecture there, and this link to the lectures and the architecture is more of an idea of us, but you can note this influence by all of the articles and the description of the buildings. Yeah.
I do have a question. I mean, me as an architect, I was very much influenced by his sketches, and I'm still fascinated how he was about his ability to drop down his sketches, and in the end, you still see that what is built was derived from the sketches. I mean, there's so many ideas nowadays in architecture when you start, and in the end, you don't see any similarities. Do you think I mean, it's just an experimental question, but do you think that if Mendelsohn would have continued his office in Berlin and still running it today, do you think he would be fond of the idea of 3D modeling as it became such a standard nowadays?
I don't know, because yesterday someone, I think Maria Stella, but I'm not pretty sure, said that for Mendelsohn, architecture was sketches.
Yeah, and also someone said that when he moved to England, someone asked him, "Why are you here? What are you going to do?" And I bring my office with me.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's exactly what is so fascinating, because I am working day by day on a 3D modeling, and it takes so much effort, and it's such a pain. And so if somebody just takes his pencil and drops down and is so convincing right from the start with this very idea, this must be, from my point of view, part of this honor that is expressed with the listing, what we want to achieve. And yesterday it was declared that the archives would, not be part of the the application, but somehow I think there is it needs to be implemented. I mean, Regina, you're. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very important question about the importance of the sketches and how he works, and if he would use the 3D modeling. I believe he would certainly do it, but not himself, but his office. Because Moritz Wohlen talked about the Mendelsohn system, and one of the most important parts of it is the question of his assistants or employees. Because he was let's say, the genius, the designer, the one that could draw with just one line the idea of a building. And we've been seeing first sketches that were brought into reality, what you were talking about right now. But the process from the sketch to the building was a totally different topic. And it worked only through the fact that he had assistants and employees that he paid very well in order to have the best assistants who were able to transfer the idea of the design into building plans. And I'm pretty sure that he would let them use it. I mean, he always was on the forefront of technique. So this is not the point. He would, I can't believe that he would design in 3D modeling, but I don't know how you do it if you really design today already in the computer, or whether you make a short sketch on the paper. This is dependent on the work of the architects today. But for Mendelsohn, the office was so important, and this was also a key for the success in Britain, for example, where Alan was talking about. He brought his assistants from Berlin and fought against or with the authorities in Britain that they gave that they accepted them, that they could enter Britain to work with Mendelsohn, because without his office, he would not have been able to realize the buildings. And he also, we were talking already about Hans Schiller. He followed Mendelsohn to Palestine and then to America. So this is a part of this Mendelsohn cosmos. Yeah. That Moritz Wohlen described so very well.
Yeah, there are so many fascinating things about Erich Mendelsohn, and I would ask myself if this ability of sketching would also be a good point of the nomination, because I day by day experience that young architects just start with 3D modeling and not do any sketches. But it would be such a good example to show that sketches could be so efficient in showing your vision. I mean, to plot down your vision is so important. And it's such a pity that nowadays it's not taught maybe or some people just don't use it. And for young architects especially, I think it would be a very, very good example.
Anyway, it's quite important what you mentioned, because this transition between the utopian drawing and the reality is a key question in the case of Mendelsohn, which is much more difficult even that moment that, for example, we wanted to mention to Zaha Hadid, because she was famous at first because of her drawings, and many, many years after that, she started to develop his own practice as an architect. But it was decades later, so the technique were more easy to develop. But in the case of Mendelsohn, this transition between...
And the impact of these drawings that were made by someone very young without a career.
Yes, notice that the first magazine of architecture in Spain, which we mentioned before, in the very first number, what they were talking about his drawings, not about his buildings, because that moment there were no buildings of Mendelsohn.
But as a topic of this session this morning, there's also this international influence, and I think related to today, and pointing out a good example for students nowadays with the nomination. I think also his cosmopolitanism is somehow in each of the students today. I mean, who does not want to travel the world? And he kind of was forced to do it, but he did it perfectly. And in that way, he transported his architecture into the world, like also the closing of the Bauhaus was, the effect was that it was transferred into the world and very well known. I think the cosmopolitan, I mean, also what Alan Power said gives us so much insight how the spreading of work works. I mean, it's spread in articles, and like nowadays, the young architects look into the journals and magazines, and you help yourself being influenced by ideas, and he had this very special ability to grasp the zeitgeist and bring it into expression with his buildings, and also in Madrid and Bilbao, as we just learned. Yeah. Thank you. Maybe are there any more questions? Okay. Oh, sorry, Maristela.
Don't worry. Patxi and Carlos, let's go back to the idea of the reception. So Mendelsohn and the reception, and Spain, newspapers, magazines specifically. Do you think that he represents a specific case who belongs to an approach of the Spanish culture to the European modernity? So I guess that Italian architects also had a large reception, the Spanish, and the French. And what about the Spanish modernist architect would think about that? I mean, I was thinking, Sert, did he ever mention Mendelsohn? Sure. I mean, what is you show the journals. I mean, they are short pieces about his drawing. But this is not a unique case. The Spanish culture extremely reception of what was happening in the rest of Europe.
Yeah, those lectures in Madrid were preceded by some lectures of Gropius, and also I think by Le Corbusier.
Yes.
And we're all about in 3 months' time, and so. What we wanted to notice is the influence of this particular lecture of Mendelsohn that is not so well known in the Spanish architecture, because there's no direct influence of the Gropius lecture on the Spanish architecture, but you can see the influence of Mendelsohn in Spanish architecture.
Is a kind of mimicry of or certain architectural language more than...
Well, I don't think it's only of a language, but of a kind of response to the city, which was very important in Mendelssohn's work. He knew how to build in the city with a new way of living, with the vehicles and the modern kind of life.
Yeah, but the Spanish did a lot of that. I mean, I was thinking about Aburto, for instance. I mean, he had a lot of interest in urban fabric. And he's a well-known, and he has a strong impact also on the Spanish intelligentsia. How do you see, I mean, why Mendelssohn? That's again the question that Jörg was also addressing. Why is Mendelssohn so unique within the Spanish context?
I think it's a mix of things, because his lectures in Madrid and Bilbao, what he first noted was his book Rusland, Europe, America. His way of thinking of the European cities as the necessity to find a place, to find a voice between these two new powers was very enriched, influence for the Spanish architect. That was a first point, I think. After that, what Patxi said is very important. The situation of the architecture in the whole city, the aerodynamic buildings they are not new, but they are responding to the necessity of this new way that we move in the city. And of course, in the third place, the formal attraction that we feel when we see buildings like Mose building. No?
I would like to step in because William Curtis is at the telephone, and I would also like to say that we have further possibilities to guide the discussion and especially the final discussion in the end. May I ask William Curtis to put up his questions?
Yes, can I be heard? All right.
Yes, everything works.
Bueno, muchas gracias por esta intervención, muy interesante. I wanted to actually make two observations about transmission. First of all, I think that both of these interventions, Alan Powers and the Spanish intervention, show the importance of printed images as transmission. But I did also want to say that there's a danger of a kind of mystification of the sketches of Mendelssohn. When we look at his wonderful streamlined buildings and his corner solutions, let us not forget the impact of Louis Sullivan's Carson Pirie Scott store of the 1890s as a model and a type which Mendelssohn imitates and transforms. He transforms it with great profundity. On the other hand, when we look at the work in Spain, which I think is very well characterized as a kind of street architecture, are we not here in danger of a kind of devaluation or to the level of motif and of cliché? These are just two questions for reflection, which lead us to the longer reflection of the idea of a modern tradition, because I really think that the impact of the Chicago school in general and of Sullivan in particular, and very particularly the Carson Pirie Scott, is very much part of the Mendelssohn story.
William Curtis for reminding us of the Chicago School and Louis Sullivan before Erich Mendelsohn. I think that is an interesting point of research then. And also what Maristella Casciato said, how much is it just a facade architecture. And I think, I mean, from my point of view, it depends on the architect and how much he dives into the thoughts of somebody else, and the question of zeitgeist. What is, I mean, like Mendelsohn listened to Bach and had himself influenced by the nature. I think all of that plays together when you create a piece of architecture, but it's hard to figure out what, and that is, of course, the work of the initiative here. Okay, thank you very much. And we have another piece or another lecture. Thank you. Yeah. We have another third contribution to prove Erich Mendelsohn's global impact on architecture, which will be held by Marco Silvestri, and the title is On the Global Impact of Erich Mendelsohn's Architecture, Sergio, Larrain's Oberbau building in Santiago, and Modern Architecture. Beforehand, let me point out some steps of Marco Silvestri's career. He is German, working at the University of Paderborn, studied art history and philosophy at the University of Stuttgart. After occupation as a freelance art historian at museums and galleries, he has been working since 2013 as a research assistant at the Chair of Material and Intangible Cultural Heritage at the University of Paderborn. From 2014 to 16, he acted as a project coordinator of the BMBF, which is the Federal Ministry of Education and Research here in Germany, funded research funded by the BMBF, and the research study is Weser Sandstone as a global cultural asset. Research stays of several months took him to Spain, Peru, and Bolivia. From August 2018 to September 2019, he was a pre-doctoral fellow of the Gerda Henkel Foundation. He earned a doctorate in art history in 2021. Congratulations still. Regarding urban planning of mining towns in the early modern period in Peru and Germany. His research interests include urban planning and architectural theory, architectural cultural exchange, Bauhüttenwesen, and 19th century architecture. He published articles on urban planning and residence and on mining towns, architectural reconstruction in the 17th century, and on the re-establishment of building lodges in the 19th century. The publication of the doctoral thesis is in preparation, as well as a peer-reviewed paper on artist migration between Spain and Peru, Mexico. Welcome, Marco Silvestri.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea, for your warm welcome. I want to thank all the organization team for inviting me to this great conference. At the turn of the century and far into the 1920s, Beaux-Arts architecture dominated in Chile. But as has often been emphasized, the development of architecture towards modernity is also connected to progress in industrialization. The growing mining sector in Chile led to the construction of new cities and production lines. New technologies and materials like prefabrication of standardized steel elements were introduced. Historicist buildings like the Biblioteca Nacional in Santiago already had an iron and glass dome. In the 1920s, the cities of Chile experienced immense population growth and some profound changes in urban planning and architecture. Furthermore, the first institutions for architectural training had been established. The education offered was influenced by architects who had traveled the US and Europe. They brought back new ideas and experiences and incorporated new methods and subjects into their teaching. Now new architectural forms were also entering the country. Luciano Kulczewski or Ricardo González Cortés, for example, used forms based on Art Nouveau and Art Deco. Even though much energy has been spent in recent years on researching topics related in the history of 20th century architecture in Chile, there's still a lot to discover. Between 1929 and 1936, during a period of only 7 years, 2 iconic buildings emerged in Santiago and Valparaiso, setting the tone for new architecture in the country, the Oberbau building and the Correo Principal. They became the most discussed new building projects in Chile and are considered a starting point of the modernist movement in the country. This applies in particular to the Oberbau. Scholars throughout Latin America and beyond understood that the iconic building adopted the style of Mendelsohn's department store architecture, or in more general terms, as having been influenced by German Expressionism. However, there are no statements or documents that indicate any such borrowing, and no in-depth analysis of the reasons of or the conditions that enabled such a borrowing has yet been carried out. With this paper, I want to explore whether Mendelssohn's architecture influenced the Chilean modernist movement when it first developed in the 1930s. What role did the Oberbau, and in particular its architect, play in this context? Are there other circumstances that help us understand how architectural exchange occurs? First, we must closely analyze the building itself. Second, we'll consider the architect examining his architectural understanding and what informed him. Third, we will widen our focus and take a brief look at the political context and the emergence of this style of architecture in Chile at that time. In 1929, having finished his studies, Sergio Larrain joined the office of his cousin, Jorge Arteaga, who was already well established in the construction industry. At the same year, Arteaga was commissioned by the Banco Hipotecario to build a warehouse for the German immigrant Richard Oberbau. According to Bosadias, even though the contract was with Arteaga, the design was entirely Larrain's. The edifice was built in 2 phases. The first consists of an almost square block, which in the 1940s was extended into a longitudinal structure. It comprises 5 floors on a corner plot in the best city center location at Esquina Calle Huérfanos and Estado. The corner of the building is curved, while the 2 sides are enclosed by staircases. These interrupt the window bands that structure the facade and create a dominant horizontal accent. The ground floor is entirely fitted out with shop windows and features 3 entrance doors, 2 at the sides and the main one at the round corner. The ground level also features a projecting cornice and a mezzanine floor. The 4 floors above consist of window bands which surround the entire structure. A flat roof tops the building and is surmounted only by recessed staircases. The appearance of the building caused a scandal in the country, with the architect being insulted in the streets. Why had he brought such dreadful things here? A mechanized thing, as they called it, even though he had such good education. Besides all these stylistic innovations, the Oberbau also incorporates many technical improvements. The layout is open plan, made possible by pillars and beams, and is interrupted only by 1.2 meter wide columns supporting continuous steel beams, some of them directly being imported from Germany. Larrain also introduced an escalator, one of the first one in Chile. The facade consists of alternating reinforced concrete parapets and strips of windows, a method that enabled this design to be used for the first time in a seismically sensitive region like Santiago. In the second construction phase, the vertical structure of the pillars was hidden beyond the window line, thus accentuating the horizontal look of the building. We can identify 3 factors that support the argument that Larrain was introduced by Mendelssohn, even if Larrain himself, as far as I know, never mentioned his connection throughout his lifetime. The first concerns the architect himself, the knowledge he had obtained and his ideas about architecture. Second, there are some remarkable similarities between the Stuttgart Schocken department store in particular and the Oberbau. And the third factor revolves around the way architectural information was mediated at that time in Chile and beyond, mostly through an extensive range of magazines. In May 1928, Larrain traveled to Europe for his honeymoon. First, he visited Le Corbusier and spent some time at his office in Paris. Then, the newlyweds headed to Germany. They traveled to Berlin and later to Dessau to visit the Bauhaus. Having heard about the importance of the Weissenhof-Siedlung, Larrain decided to visit Stuttgart as well. At that time, Stuttgart was a bustling modernist city with a number of innovative building projects in progress simultaneously. One was the so-called Tagblattturm, one of the first tower blocks in Germany built with reinforced concrete. Another one was the Schocken department store, Kaufhaus Schocken, created by Erich Mendelsohn. The Schocken must have been finished when Larrain visited Stuttgart sometime in the autumn of 1928. In June of that year, Mendelsohn himself was on site, and on 26 September, he announced completion of the construction work and the opening in October. Interestingly, that same year, Richard Oberbauer, who commissioned the Edificio Oberbauer, had emigrated to Chile from Ludwigsburg, a small town near Stuttgart, where his family owned a successful warehouse. It is plausible that Oberbauer had heard of the project in Stuttgart and had a similar building in mind for the new branch of his company in booming Santiago. Mendelsohn's well-known expertise in this field and his activities in this area might have inspired Larrain and Oberbauer to look at these developments. We know at that time other department store companies and architects took up these ideas, as the new warehouse designed by Eisenlohr and Pfenning for Breuninger and Stuttgart shows. Edificio Oberbauer was the first project Larrain considered his own. In a late interview, Larrain admitted that, and I quote him, "I remember that the first projects I did were actually copies or strongly influenced," quote end. Some of Mendelsohn's architectural innovations can be found here. These include large shop windows on the ground floor, rooms brightly lit from window bands and reflections from the ceiling, a flat roof dispensing with inner courtyards and staircases pointed on the side. Larrain also used similar technical facilities such as escalators and lifts. From a formal point of view, Larrain picks up on the canopy above the ground floor, which extends all around the facade. Working with the corner side, he also rounds the corner to integrate the building into the urban environment. He structures the facade horizontally and only interrupts this orientation with the vertical stairwells. These, in turn, extend above the roof line of the main building and step back slightly. Together, all this creates a Mendelssohnian-type dynamism by creating tension between horizontal alignments, certain verticality, and carefully placed setbacks. Considering Larrain's architectural formation and vision, it is clear that he rejected historicist architecture. He was often discussing this topic with his teachers, for example, writing to Arteaga, and I quote him again, "Jorge, you create stereotyped and dead architecture. You have to create living architecture. I want to create living architecture." His formation at first, more or less autodidactic, started early. He was 14 years old when his family spent some time in Europe. There he received private lessons and began to engage deeply with art and architecture. Through his brother, he was in contact with Vicente Huidobro, a Chilean poet who collaborated with Amédée Ossonfon and Le Corbusier in the journal L'Esprit Nouveau. Larrain became an avid reader of L'Esprit, and his brother gave him a copy of Corbusier's Vers une architecture. But Larrain rejected Le Corbusier's architectural style, which he considered inhuman, repulsive, and devoid of life. At the same time, he sympathized with Le Corbusier's approach, which was directed against historicist architecture. In architecture, Corbusier described as dishonest and unaware of the issues facing his profession at that times, like urbanization, new housing concepts, and so on. Larrain's rejection of both historicist architecture and formalism is reminiscent of Mendelssohn's approach. In an early letter, Mendelssohn stated, and I quote him, "As a student, I rebelled against the then prevailing teaching of historical styles." He also Mendelsohn also rejected the concept of Corbusier's unité d'habitation, as his own theory of architecture, as we all well know, was built upon the functional dynamic, resulting in an architecture that should not be decoupled from emotions or artistic expression. Back in Chile, Larrain studied at the Universidad Pontifical Católica. Although change was already in the air, his architectural education was still mainly based on Vignola and what he called the Guardet. He completed his studies in 1928 with a thesis on a railway station. His plans, which were published in the magazine Arquitectura y Arte Decorativo, showed some relationship to Art Deco and also Expressionism. While Larrain was pursuing a career as an architect, his interest in integrating new forms and analyzing contemporary architecture led him being appointed as professor of art history at the Catholic University of Santiago in 1931 at the young age of 26. He became dean of the architectural faculty in 1948, and in 1952 he invited, for example, Josef Albers to teach a course and implement his teaching methods. Besides his personal experiences, we also know that as a student, he had subscribed to magazines like The Style, L'Architecture Vivante, Carrière des Arts, and especially Moderne Bauformen. In a 1927 issue of Moderne Bauform, for instance, Ludwig Hilbersheimer published his essay Internationale Baukunst. This included the Herpich commercial building in Berlin and the textile factory in St. Petersburg. Issues from 1928 contained Hugo Hering's essay Neues Bauen, dedicated a whole 3 pages to Mendelssohn architecture alone, featuring his department store buildings, the Duisburg, Cohn and Epstein Warhouse, the Deukon House in Berlin, and the Petershof office building in Wroclaw. It remains unclear whether he also received the Wasmuths Monatshefte für Baukunst, which had already given Mendelssohn special attention in issue 8, 1924. Contemporary architectural journals in Chile printed illustrations of Mendelssohn's work too. Gustavo Casali, in his 1929 article L'Architettura Moderna o Viva, published in the journal Arquitectura y Arte Decorativo, featured a picture of the Petershof warehouse in Wroclaw in a discussion of Germany's modern architecture. Casali underlines the possibilities created by reinforced concrete constructions to enable better management of light and air. In a 1934 issue of Revista de Arquitectura, analyzing the work of different architects, an author referred to Hans Steineder as being like Le Corbusier in terms of logic, and like Mendelssohn and Behrens with regard to sentiment. Clearly, it was assumed that the reader had knowledge of the works of Le Corbusier, Mendelssohn, and Berenson. Larrain's architecture was also considered explicitly German by contemporaries in a 1941 article on the modernization of Santiago in the magazine Arquitectura y Urbanismo. Against the background of political developments, the Oberbau marked a turning point towards the long overdue modernization of the country. In 1927, a new president was elected in Chile, Carlos Ibáñez del Campo. One of his main goals was the extensive modernization of the public sector. In particular, his goals were to reform administration, to establish credit institutions, and to create a general plan for public buildings. Special attention was given to the cities of Santiago, Viña del Mar, and Valparaíso, initiating measures in support of urban development, beautification, and infrastructure. This process resulted in new construction projects in Santiago, of which Larrain's Oberbau is one of the earliest examples. Through their projects, Larrain and other architects changed the physiognomy of the city center. The direct consequence of these modernizing tendencies can also be seen outside Santiago. In Valparaíso, the major Laureate Rosas followed Ibáñez's plans even during a time of economic crisis. He aimed to improve the roading infrastructure and public spaces, and this included tearing down edifices to change the look of the inner city and allow the reshaping of large inner city squares. In 1936, the state of Chile commissioned a new Cerro Principal in Valparaíso. Marcelo de Glun Samson was appointed to replace the neoclassical style post office, which had been damaged in an earthquake. It is located in the southeast side of one of Valparaiso's most important squares, the Plaza Sotomayor, and was commissioned by the Ministry of Public Works. In the early 1930s, Rosas had standardized the building lines of the square. In this context, the building thus marked a paradigm shift away from historicist architecture. This is clearly a success of Larrain's Oberbau and continues the trend by integrating the corner of the building even more clearly into the urban context. It occupies the whole street block and is no longer just part of it, as was the case with the Oberbau. The corner joins two streets that meet the square at this point and form a dynamic hinge. In contrast to the Oberbau, Deglin expands the formal language by including portholes. He also places greater emphasis on the contrast between the horizontal window bands and the vertical staircase on both sides of the building. The structure consists of a reinforced concrete frame and an open floor plan. The lifts were ordered from Germany, but could not be delivered due to the war. For Valparaiso, the Correo marked the starting point, and more buildings in a similar style followed. For example, the Edificio de Rentas Cooperativa Vitalica, built by Alfredo Vargas Stoller in 1937. At this point, we should return to Santiago. In the period of 1931 to 1934, Larrain was given the opportunity to work further on his architectural ideas in Arteaga's office. He realized 4 residential projects in Calle Merced and José Miguel de Barra, directly on Cerro Santa Lucia in the old city center. The 9-story building and the Edificio Merced show Sergio Larrain's incorporating Mendelsohn ideas in a new way. With its slightly curved facade, the Edificio Santa Lucia is aligned with the street. Also, it does not have the same window bands as the Oberbau. The orientation is decidedly horizontal despite the building's height. This results in a certain dynamism that was clearly intended, as the preliminary study shows.
We have another
Okay, thank
minutes.
you. I will come to an end.
Okay.
This drawing and the curved shape of the building with the upper floor step back is reminiscent of almost contemporaneous buildings by Mendelssohn, such as the Schocken department store in Chemnitz or the Columbus House. With the Edificio Merced, built in 1934, Larrain continues this development. The curved facade aligns perfectly with the street, and the shape of the horizontally arranged windows is emphasized by the striking lintels and stills. The round windows break the horizontality of the building and provide contrast to the vertical structures. And coming to an end, I will show quickly some examples which followed after that. For example, in the 1930s, other buildings appeared in a similar style and were publicated also in Moderne Bauform, like this one of Roberto Davila Carson, and also in the late 1930s, like the Clinica Santa Maria by Eduardo Costa Balsegueres and Andres Garafulik Jankovic. And to come to an end, I want to show you the rental of the apartment house by José Carles y Guillermo Caulen, located at a very central place of Santiago de Chile, the Plaza de la Constitución. Can I make a last conclusion? Okay. In conclusion, it can be said that Mendelssohn's architecture had some influence in Chile. The combination of technical innovation, structural innovation, and formal innovation were widely adopted and can be attributed to an awareness of Mendelssohn's work. His buildings were depicted in specialist journals, and his formal language featured extensively in the architecture of Valparaiso, especially Santiago. Sergio Larrain acted as one of the most important transmitters, setting the first signal with his Oberbau, which in turn influenced various other architects. Coming back to one of the topics of this symposium, reflecting on modern architecture in Chile and in Latin America especially can help to clarify Mendelssohn's influence over others, like Erich yesterday pointed out, and his impact on the global architectural culture as part of criterion number 2 of selection regarding the World Heritage List. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Marco Silvestri. In order to save some time, because we are short of time now, I would like to combine the questions to Marco Silvestri with the general question for this session. So I ask you, Patxi, Eguiluz, and Mr. Copertone to join us. And also, I would like to ask the technique to add Alan Powers to our question, to our final discussion of this panel. Are there questions from the audience, first of all? With focus on his international impact, I found this very interesting because you did really prove that there were articles related to his work and that he held lectures. And I think a part of the work would be also to distinguish the influence of Bauhaus to the influence of Mendelssohn's architecture. And there is, I think, really proof from my point of view, the architecture of Erich Mendelsohn also is more classical because it always has the base, the shaft, and the top, which is sometimes missing in the Bauhaus, and finally led to the GDR prefabrication things, which would not have been possible with the Genius Loci style of architecture from Erich Mendelsohn. But still the question also to Marco Silvestri first. Do you have an idea of what the special outstanding value for the application could be in terms of your presentation here?
I think this is a tough one, but I want to reply on this because I think I only pointed out Chile, but we have to have a briefer look also to the rest of Latin America, because this is only one example. This is only Chile. You can also have a look at, for example, and I noted this, the edificios built in the same time in La Paz, in Bolivia. There are so many. And in Montevideo también, also, or in Buenos Aires. And there's so much reception of Mendelssohnian work, and this is only one little part of it. So maybe we have to have a briefer look to this and the way of the reception in Latin America, because at this time there was so much building projects, activities, also in urban planning, urban refabrication. And it is well known that Le Corbusier had a huge impact on this in Latin America. But as Alan Powers today before said, maybe we can consider Mendelssohn a little bit like a Trojanisches Pferd, like a Trojan horse of modernity in South America. And maybe this could be one point of integrate him in this discussion.
Slowly, I start to have an idea why Le Corbusier's application needed 10 years. So there's a lot of work to be done. And of course, there are other countries, not only England and Spain and Chile. But how do you think? I mean, we have those. I started with pointing out from yesterday's discussion the innovation of construction, for instance, which from my point of view is so I'm sorry, I will come back to your question soon, which from my point is so inherent in this new avant-garde style, which is also, I mean, together with the Bauhaus architecture, but it's hard for me to distinguish what the special projects concentrate on. Would it be the same for them to look through the architectural journals and see Bauhaus and Erich Mendelsohn, and or is there a special focus on Erich Mendelsohn's work? And I don't know. I don't have any idea how somebody could figure out about that. So, but first, can Please, can you introduce yourself?
My name is Vladimir Šlapeta.
Hello.
And I would like to thank to all three speakers that they brought now attention to South America, but we can follow reflections of the work of Mendelssohn also in Central Europe and also in Eastern Europe. I would like to mention here one name, Lois Welsenbacher, who was operating between Innsbruck and Munich. He was student of Theodor Fischer, and after the war he was professor at the Viennese Academy. But the most important work he produced in 20s and 30s, and he built, for instance, Villa Buchreutner in Linz, or Villa Hajerowski especially in Zell am See, and who somehow brought ideas of Mendelssohn, also with very impressive sketches at the beginning, to Alps, to territorium of mountains, reflecting terrain by very original way, of course, influenced by Mendelssohn at the beginning. This is one case. Lois Welsenbacher, he built also in Germany one villa in Recklinghausen, which is a little bit like Mies villas in Krefeld. And he built also a big airport, I think in Halle, in late 30s in Germany. So he was operating between Munich and Innsbruck. And he was, like Mendelssohn, extremely impressed and inspired by music. He never missed any important opera in Viennese time after the war. This is one case from Austria. And I would like also to mention that if you are walking through the center of Bucharest, you will find some buildings which have a similar impact as buildings in Santiago. And of course, there was an impact on Czechoslovak architecture. For instance, on Bohuslav Fuchs, he built as a very young architect, and he followed Berlin development very carefully. Got from him a book by Bruno Taut, so he was perfectly informed, and he built with his partner Josef Štěpánek 1921-22 a power plant. So similar task, industrial task, like the Einstein Tower, and it was somehow like a step from this Czech cubism and Rondo cubism to dynamic form and energy, which we could observe in the work of Mendelssohn. So this strong impact of Mendelssohn internationally should be included to the proposal to the World Heritage. Thank you. Sorry
Vladimir.
that I disturbed you so long time.
Thank you, Vladimir Šlapeta. You are a specialist. We need to consult you, I think. There was another question here. Oh, okay, there.
Hello. I would like to add something what Professor Šlapeta also suggested, because Erich Mendelsohn was discussed worldwide, even not in Czechoslovakia, but in Poland, in Soviet Union, and also in other countries. I would like to mention that in Poland, in 1926, in Warsaw, the most important gallery of art, they invited, of course, not personally Mendelssohn, but his project, and they were exhibited together with Le Corbusier. So also in Moscow, Современная архитектура in 1926 exposed Erich Mendelsohn projects, and it was Ginsburg and Milinis who wrote that article. So it is also something very important to what was catched by the very progressive Russian architects to decide to expose the Mendelsohn projects in Sovietskaya Architektura. So we have to search that trials all over the world how Mendelssohn was discussed, and it was for sure visible in Poland and in Soviet Union at that moment.
Yeah, I'm sure that the three countries we picked here are not, I mean, his work is not limited to those countries, and he had an impact on the whole world. But there was, yes, another question? Please
there's a
yourself.
question in the chat and a comment by Tim Altenhof. He says, it would be quite interesting to produce a taxonomy of the many epigones that emerged in Tel Aviv, Madrid, Santiago de Chile, and other places to allow for close readings and comparisons between all these projects. So that's the comment. And there's a question by Maria Soltesik, and it would be nice to open the micro for her. Thank you.
Hello?
Yes, the people can hear you.
Yes, hello. I'm Maria Soltesik from Gdynia. I would also continue the topic about the influence on the architecture of Eastern Europe, especially in Poland, and on Polish architecture between the wars, especially my town, Gdynia, which was newly built in that period, was influenced by the Mendelssohnian forms. Of course, many Polish towns, this time Lwów was also, Lwów, now Ukraine, was also influenced, belonged to Polish architecture, was also strongly influenced by Mendelssohnian forms. And of course, Warsaw, Katowice, many Polish cities. It is for our circle, for our initiative, it will be very good to point out this special feature. I think the two special features of Mendelssohnian architecture, which are present or in all over, not only European architecture, but in all over the world architecture of those times, which are the round corners and the horizontal, strongly horizontal lines. It was something which differs Mendelssohnian architecture from Bauhaus architecture. So these features are found widely in the world architecture from many countries and from this period. So it should be stressed in our project. Thank you.
Yeah, it's we need to figure out some issues, but as Maria Stella Casciato said, it shouldn't be just the outlook, or there's more in architecture than just the appearance, but of course it's important. Other questions?
I've got the microphone. Thank you very much indeed for those presentations. I think it's very important to look at the results of publications of Mendelssohn's work. These are more formal adaptations of buildings to sites following Mendelssohn's kind of architecture. I would like to raise our attention to more refined influences in the sense of construction, teaching or using modern techniques in construction, as for example, the Bexhill Delaware Pavilion was the first welded steel frame in Britain. So this is something, I think, even more deeper influence on the development of architecture. And I think we should really take care not to collect those rounded corners, which Mendelsohn himself did not like when he arrived in Tel Aviv. We know what he said, ich und Le Corbusier, not me and Le Corbusier. This is a quote, but he was not amused about the fact that it is possible to imitate just these rounded corners. So I would like to draw really the attention to the special quality of Mendelssohn's work, building for the precise plot of land, for the precise commission, and with a very elaborated modern construction, always at the front of the development of construction techniques. We've seen it today here. You can see it in Bexhill. This is what really determines Mendelssohn's architecture from all those followers that are very important because they show the influence. But I think it is helpful for us to distinguish between the original and his special knowledge and interest in innovating construction, and the architects that were certainly also forced to use those forms by their employers. But when we compare the Oberbau building in Chile, which I find absolutely interesting, but in comparison to the Mendelsohn buildings, you see that the ground floor isn't that lifted up like this building, so that in order to have an absolutely glazed ground floor, because the construction isn't that refined. And this is, I think, a very interesting and important topic for us to work on, the influence of construction developments of Mendelssohn's offices, diverse offices in the course of his life. Thank you.
I don't know if it is one of the articles that we mentioned. What was surprising for the writer was the question of the thickness, the loss of a space that with the Spanish traditional construction was, and the necessity to look at this new kind of construction with Mendelssohn. But for me, one of the key points is that the spread of the Mendelssohnian influence was one of the most important things, was the desire of the architects of that moment to be part of something, to be part of this new conception of the city, where, for example, one of the main characters in the new city is the car. So the aerodynamics comes from a necessity, because you have to include the cars, the movement, the way in which we move in this new city. So this response to Mendelssohn to these new necessities is what attracted the attention of the architect. But there is a formal aspect that drew the attention to it, because it was really attractive. So the combination of these three aspects for me is very important.
I also, I mean, closely, I become an idea of, or I get an idea of what the kind of work is behind it. And I found it very interesting what you said, to follow up with drawings, for instance, how they change step by step. And there's always a decision to be made, how many columns, how many beams, and sometimes from one step from the 1 to 100 scale to the 1 to 50 scale, you decide for different construction because of certain reasons. And that should be also a very good point of view to point out the construction topic. Yeah, I think that's a very good contribution. Yeah, please, Ita, Heinze, Greenberg.
No.
No.
No, okay. I just wanted to point out how important this is, what Regina said before. I think there were different dialogues in Mendelssohn's career. So the very first one was material, with the Einstein Tower, the dialogue with material, with new materials. Then came the construction, then maybe culture, and then in the end it became religion. Or how to translate the dialogue with God into buildings. So we have always this dialogical principle which refers to different topics, and I think this differentiates Mendelssohn also very much from the fashion of forms, because this became, the round corner and the line became a fashion because of the temporalization of the urban space, through the car and through traffic. So and Mendelssohn turned away from this. Regina just said it. He in Tel Aviv, he said one shouldn't build round corners and streamlines for 10 years anymore. One should forbid them, because, and one can ask oneself, what would he have done if in America he would have got commissions for department stores? What would he have done to copy himself again? One can only wonder, because after this explosion of fashion, of Mendelssohnian fashions, these are interesting questions.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to ask a question to Jörg. I'm not a researcher. I'm curious to find out how the application will be set up. My idea is that at the end, somebody is choosing several buildings from Erich Mendelsohn, and then we have all these, like in a table, we have all these outstanding values, and we make a cross mark which building is or which value is represented in what building. Is that the way it will be done, or?
I think you are faster than we are in proceeding the whole issue. This is an initial meeting here to do this nomination, not yet do know who is the lead partner and what is the state party and all these things around it. And we do not have yet discussed enough, I think, the so-called narrative. Or what is the outstanding universal value, and what kind of attributes are we looking for, which can be attached to this outstanding values? And I think it's very important that we discuss today that the question of round corners and of horizontal lines and of what Ita called fashionable items, that's not what we are asking for. It's interesting, of course, it's interesting, and it is surprising to see how many similarities we can find all over the world, not only in Europe, but also in Russia. The Russian constructivism might be influenced, of course, by Mendelssohn and his work. But we have to think about what is this kind of architecture which is different from from Bauhaus, from Neues Bauen, from Wohnmaschine, etc. What is the specific contribution? We are looking for this, and this should be discussed in advance, and then we can see what are the buildings or what are the objects which can convey this message. I think we do not yet have it, and that is why we try to collect further ideas, and we will also try to continue this discussion next year or in autumn in Haifa, because it is necessary.
I would like to say.
I think there was.
Yeah. I would like to say one thing, because we have talked about the importance of the image in the city, but the main thing in Mendelssohn is the way he answers to the different places with a different kind of solution, because it's very different how he responds to a place in the city center than the way he answers to a house in the sovereigns. So I think this is the key point of his architecture. We have tried to bring here the importance in the city because it's what we have noticed. But I think that the big influence of him is the way he responds differently to different situations.
He didn't try to impose a style that is very representative of him, I think. He responds differently in Europe or in Israel or in the States. That's something quite different to the Bauhaus way of thinking, no? This not imposed vision is key to understand his value.
May I remind that we have another final panel discussion, but Alona was... all right, there's another 2 questions we leave to this panel and then have a lunch break. May you introduce yourself, please?
Andrea Putz, TU Munich, and 10 years ago responsible for the renovation of the department store in Schock and Chemnitz. When we look at Erich Mendelsohn in the 1920s, late 1920s, I think we should also stress that it's not just the architect doing such wonderful, marvelous drawings, but also a very successful boss of an office. The office of Erich Mendelsohn in the late 1920s was rather big for Berlin and Germany. And a lot of people working there later continued also during the Nazi time as organizers of big offices themselves. So it was a very efficient way of doing architecture. And it's something you can actually see in his buildings in the way something what Regina Stephan just said, in the use of materials, specific constructions. But the details I like most about them is where you see that the overall design does not really synchronize. So if you just go outside here, you see the top lights to the staircase, and suddenly the geometry changes, something very similar we had in the Schocken department store in Chemnitz. So sometimes you see these little details where you have the feeling that somehow communication between people in the office doing different plans, maybe at some minor, not so important details did not function. It's something you actually can see in these buildings, despite these new technologies and materials. Life is also this efficient way of doing a big architectural company. And I wonder, and maybe it's to the podium, and Alan Powers mentioned it, is that something which was also internationally recognized, that there's someone who shows you how to do modern architecture in an efficient, modern, maybe even tailoring way to do modern architecture as a big company.
That's a good contribution. I think this also could be very easily read by the drawings they do. I mean, if you compare his drawings out of his office with classical offices that are, drawing like single stones and things, then you get an idea of maybe he's also thinking very efficiently. Yeah, thank you. We do have Alona, yes?
And okay, we'll continue later on, but I just wanted to relate to your concern about the forms. And I think that it is important because Mendelsohn offers forms from the modern city. And the idea of the aspiration for, I think that the examples that we've seen are metropolitan examples, like the center of the metropolitan area. And it is, the forms are really important in the sense that I don't know if we have any other modernist architect that has offered something to the modern city that is so unique in the way that it's urban design and architecture at the same time. And I think that what we've heard right now, it's an amazingly important comment because it's the idea of management, of the idea of being able, we've heard this morning, the idea that within a year, this building was from first line to completion took place. This means management. This means also the knowledge of technology. So I think we have, when we think about other modernists at this time, they were nothing compared to the idea that it's already a fully operated machine. It's not, Miss Van der Rohe, right, trying to do a pavilion in the brick house and several courthouses, or the villas of Le Corbusier. I mean, we're talking about the production of modern architecture for the modern city in a way that we don't see elsewhere. So I think that the forms are part of it. And I think that, Ita, what is really interesting about what you said about the different facets of it, that maybe this kind of elastic continuity can work from the idea of the materials to the idea of the city and elsewhere. I mean, that the continuity within these facets is really important. So,
I would like to get William Curtis' question online, and then we will postpone the questions to the final panel. He is online?
Yes, thank you. Can I be heard okay? Yes?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. This is a very fascinating series of questions which are emerging. I couldn't help thinking about that wonderful book, The Shape of Time, by George Kubler, where he talks about prime objects and replications and the structure of traditions, how paradigmatic buildings or ideas or forms are created and then transformed in inventive ways, or else reduced to cliches. And actually, I do think we have here the problem of the assessment of quality. Many of the examples shown are perfectly interesting cliches applied to cities here, there, and everywhere. And that's part of the question, is if there's not here a kind of new vernacular, as indeed there may have been in Tel Aviv, but one which involves devaluation of prime objects of high intensity. But that gets me to the much more difficult question that you must be having, who are assessing. What about Mendelssohn's works themselves? Do you think they're all absolutely excellent and astonishing and superb, or some better than others? How are you going to set about this question of assessing? And is the value somehow to be attributed just because he's copied 150 times? I mean, this strikes me as a rather odd way of looking at the problem. So I think that the gradation of quality is part of the question for his, let's say, universal value in terms of culture. Some years ago, I rewrote Le Corbusier Ideas and Forms and added a chapter at the end on transforming Le Corbusier, which tried to look at the different ways in which people read, reread, misunderstood, understood, projected their own influence is the wrong word. It's a rereading which takes place according to the kind of problems that later architects are trying to solve. But I think that should all be scraped off and is quite irrelevant, in a sense, to the assessment of Mendelssohn himself and his works and their universal value or not. That's the way I would imagine seeing the question. So quite the contrary, the fact that he's copied 100 times doesn't seem to me to be particularly relevant to the case of assessing the value of Mendelssohn. At least this is the question I would pose.
Very much, William Curtis. I would like to finish this panel now because we are running out of time, and let's give the lunch break another 15 minutes. So we will meet again here at 1:15, and you're welcome to take some lunch pieces at the buffet outside.